The content in this video is based on factual, real-life events and public records. All opinions expressed are for educational and documentary purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised, as some scenes may depict sensitive content. This video is intended for informative purposes and complies with YouTube's guidelines. On a fog-soaked night inside Alcatraz, an officer doing his final rounds froze when a metal bunk slammed against the wall, coming from a cell sealed since 1963. Thousands of miles away at Sing Sing, a corrections lieutenant reported the same thing only 48 hours later. Shadows moving in a locked corridor, footsteps echoing in a housing block that had been evacuated hours earlier. None of the inmates in either prison had access to those areas. None of the doors had been opened. And yet the disturbances kept happening, louder each night, spreading from one tier to another, as if both prisons, two of the most infamous in American history, were answering each other. The incident reports were quietly archived. The officers involved refused interviews. And the recordings? They were pulled from the system before anyone could review them. Something was happening inside these walls. Something the public was never supposed to hear. And this is where the story begins. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content. The ferry cut through the choppy San Francisco Bay water like a blade, the cold wind slapping against the metal hull as Noah Briggs stood shackled near the railing. His wrists were cuffed, his ankles locked together, but it was the weight in his chest that felt heavier than the restraints. Alcatraz rose ahead of him, a jagged piece of stone hammered into the water, shaped by fog and silence and stories that never really died. The officers didn't speak. The other inmates didn't breathe louder than they had to. Everyone understood what it meant to arrive here. Even in the modern era, the name alone carried pressure. Noah shifted slightly, tattoos stretching across his forearms, black and gray ink of broken watch pieces, gears, and cracked hourglasses, symbols of time he already felt slipping from him. He had done federal time before, but nothing like this. Nothing with this kind of reputation. He kept his back straight and his eyes forward when they walked him off the boat. The officers marched in formation, like they'd done this hundreds of times, and maybe they had. The prison smelled like steel and sea salt, mixed with something stale, something old that felt trapped in the walls. Inside the processing area, fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered overhead, giving off a teal-amber glow that made the concrete seem colder than it already was. Noah followed the commands, letting them remove everything from him: belt, shoes, chain necklace. The room was silent except for the clicking of metal and the scratching of pens filling out intake sheets. A correctional officer stamped his file and gave him his new identity through the bars of his glasses. Briggs Noah, Housing Unit C. The officer didn't look up as he said it. It was routine for him, but Noah knew that the letter meant more than a simple assignment. Housing C wasn't random. Housing C was where they kept men who had a history of leadership, organization, or psychological resistance. It meant they watched him before he even walked in. His first steps down the corridor felt heavier than the ferry ramp. Cells lined both sides, stacked in rows, steel doors clanging shut whenever someone moved inside. Some men watched through the bars, some ignored him entirely. One man with tattoos crossing his jawline nodded slowly, like he recognized something in Noah. Maybe strength. Maybe trouble. When Noah reached his cell, the officer opened the door with a simple, "In." No explanation, no warning. That was how Alcatraz worked, cold efficiency. The cell felt smaller than he expected. A narrow bed, a small sink, a toilet bolted to the wall. But the worst part wasn't the size. It was the feeling, as if the concrete itself had memory. As if the walls had absorbed decades of tension and were now pressing it back out into him. He placed his hands on the bunk, the rough blanket scratching against his palms. For a moment, he closed his eyes. He had survived worse places. He reminded himself of that. But then he heard something. A knock, barely audible, from the cell beside him. A single tap. Another. A pause. Then 3 taps in quick rhythm. Prison communication wasn't new to him, but the pattern didn't match anything he knew. When Noah leaned toward the wall, the tapping stopped abruptly. Silence settled again. Too quickly. Across the tier, another door slammed, and a correctional officer announced evening lockdown. Noah sat on his bunk, looking around, feeling the rhythm of the place, the invisible rules, the silent observation. He watched the shadows move across the floor as the last bit of daylight faded. Despite the stillness, his mind churned. Men didn't send messages unless they wanted something, or unless something was about to happen. The next morning came with whistles and the clanking of metal doors. Noah walked toward the cafeteria, staying alert. Eyes watched him, not all of them unfriendly, but none of them careless. Word traveled fast inside prisons. New arrivals meant new alliances, new risks, new stories. He found a place at an empty table, the tray in front of him holding scrambled eggs, a grayish slab of toast, and a cup of something hot but tasteless. 10 seconds later, someone sat opposite him without asking. A tall man, mid-40s, with sleeves of ink running down both arms. His name, as Noah overheard another inmate whisper, was Marcus Hale. A long-timer. Smart. Respected. Dangerous, if necessary. Marcus leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. "You heard tapping your first night?" he asked, voice low but steady. Noah didn't react right away. He stayed still, studying the man's expression. Calm. Direct. "How'd you know?" Noah asked. Marcus gave a slow nod. "Means they clocked you early. Testing what kind of man you are. Testing what you do in silence." Noah kept his face neutral, but his pulse kicked up. "Who's they?" Marcus didn't answer. Instead, he picked up a piece of his toast, tore it in half, and ate it like he had all the time in the world. "Testing happens more at Sing Sing," he continued, voice dropping even lower. "But Alcatraz, this place has its own version. You'll see." Before Noah could respond, officers called for the next shift rotation. Marcus stood, nodded once, and walked away. Noah watched him disappear into the line of orange jumpsuits. Something was wrong inside this place. Something organized. Something that didn't need to be spoken. Later that afternoon, while Noah was doing intake interviews for prison work assignments, an officer asked a routine question. Any history of conflict with staff or inmates? But the man's eyes were focused too carefully on Noah's reaction, as if reading him. As if the question wasn't about paperwork, it was about measuring his psychology. By evening, the tapping returned. Only this time, it came from 2 cells away. Different rhythm. More urgent. Noah stepped toward the wall and pressed his ear against the cool concrete. The sound stopped again. Silence tightened the air. At midnight, a shadow moved past Noah's door. Footsteps dragged slowly, not like a guard's deliberate walk. Almost like someone pacing, restless, unsettled. Noah sat up on his bunk, alert. A voice spoke softly from the tier, just loud enough to be heard but not recognized. "You're being watched." The steps continued, fading into the other end of the block. The door stayed shut. The night didn't breathe again for a long time. And the tapping didn't return until dawn. 3 taps, a pause, 3 more. A signal, a warning, or an invitation Noah didn't ask for. Whatever it meant, Alcatraz had already begun shaping him, studying him, pushing him into a story he didn't understand yet. And in federal prisons, stories weren't just lived, they were engineered. This time, Noah didn't lean into the wall, because now he wasn't sure who was tapping, or how many were listening. The heavy metal doors clanged shut behind the new arrivals, echoing through the long, narrow corridors of Alcatraz. The smell of damp concrete and disinfectant mingled with the faint tang of iron from the bars. Inmates in bright orange jumpsuits, some with inked tattoos winding along their arms and necks, watched silently, measuring each newcomer. Every glance was cautious, every step calculated. Here, even a simple nod could carry meaning, a test of courage or a signal of weakness. The morning routine began under the harsh fluorescent lights that threw elongated teal and amber shadows across the floors. Inmates lined up for breakfast, steel trays clattering against metal tables. The meals were uniform: gruel, slices of bread, and weak coffee, each portion a reminder of the rigid control exercised over their lives. Daniel Morris, a wiry man with a sleeve of tattoos climbing from wrist to elbow, eyed the tray before him. He knew the rhythm of Alcatraz, the way power flowed silently through guards and prisoners alike. One misstep, one careless word, and the hierarchy could shift in an instant. Meanwhile, in Sing Sing, the corridors felt almost alive. The walls, pockmarked with the years of scrawled graffiti and faded paint, held the whispers of generations of inmates. Here, the culture was different. The prisoners carried stories of survival, rebellion, and camaraderie etched not only in their tattoos but in the tense set of their shoulders. Guards in Navy uniforms patrolled methodically, eyes scanning the lines of men, hands resting lightly on batons, observing but not always interfering. Every step, every glance, was a negotiation of territory, a silent declaration of control. Lunch brought with it a momentary calm, but only on the surface. Inmates at Alcatraz moved through the mess hall like predators in a calculated dance. Conversation was scarce. The sounds of chewing and the occasional scrape of a chair were amplified in the cavernous room. Daniel caught sight of a folded note slid under a cell door, its edges worn. Inside, cryptic numbers and letters hinted at alliances and warnings, messages that could alter the balance of power if read correctly. At Sing Sing, the yard opened like a cage within a cage. The sun reflected harshly off concrete walls, bouncing light that highlighted the tattoos inked across bare arms and necks. The prisoners' eyes darted, calculating distance, reading intentions. Some practiced basketball shots, others simply paced, muscles tensing with each movement. Even leisure was a test of patience and control. One wrong move, one flash of aggression, and the echoes of violence would ripple across the yard. Back in Alcatraz, isolation cells loomed. Their doors were small rectangles of steel with glass slits at eye level, revealing nothing but the blank, harsh light of the hallway. Prisoners who entered these cells often returned with a hardened gaze, their movements sharper, more cautious. The psychological weight was heavy. Silence here was not peace, but pressure, a constant reminder that every action was being watched, recorded, and analyzed. By late afternoon, both facilities settled into a rhythm that only insiders could navigate. Inmates whispered through cracks in the walls, passed subtle signals, and maintained a careful balance of alliances and rivalries. Tattoos became symbols of history and identity, each line and swirl a story of survival, each mark a silent code of strength or warning. Orange jumpsuits, so uniform in appearance, concealed layers of emotion and strategy, the very essence of life behind bars. As the sun dipped over the waters off Alcatraz, reflecting a faint teal glow on the waves, the prisoners stared from their cells, wondering what tomorrow would bring. Across New York, in Sing Sing, shadows stretched across the yard, lengthening with the setting sun. In both prisons, one truth remained. The walls were not just concrete and steel. They were mirrors, reflecting the fragility and resilience of the human mind. Control defined the system, survival defined the inmates, but hope, fleeting and fragile, lingered in the quiet moments between commands and confinement. The night settled over Alcatraz like a heavy blanket, fog curling around the edges of the island. Inside the cells, the clinking of chains and the distant hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence. Daniel Morris lay on his narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling, tracing the outline of his tattoos with his eyes. Each swirl, line, and symbol a story of battles fought outside these walls, now pressed into survival within them. The isolation, even among fellow inmates, weighed on him. Every sound was amplified. The drip of water from the sink, the scrape of metal against concrete, the occasional cough echoing down the corridor. In Sing Sing, the evening yard emptied slowly, leaving behind a residue of tension. The prisoners returned to their cells, their bodies coiled from the day's exertions, minds replaying every glance, every whispered word that could indicate danger or alliance. Tattoos on their forearms and necks glinted in the dim amber lighting as they moved with caution, always aware that one misstep could unravel the careful balance of power they had worked so hard to maintain. Daniel's cellmate, Raymond Carter, had begun to change. The constant monotony of controlled meals, regimented movements, and the ever-watchful eyes of guards had begun to gnaw at his mind. He pressed his palms against the metal bars, imagining the world beyond, the water, the streets, the free air he could no longer touch. The tattoos on his arms were a roadmap of choices made, mistakes endured, and identities preserved. Yet here, in Alcatraz, they were just marks, meaningless to the steel and stone that surrounded him. Across the hall, an experiment of control unfolded. Warden Ellis had implemented new psychological tests, subtle and invisible, designed to push the inmates to the edge without overt force. The vents hummed with a low-frequency vibration, designed to disturb sleep, to create unease. Prisoners began to whisper about it. Notes passed, murmurs behind the metal grates. The system was watching, analyzing, recording. The fear of the unseen observer added another layer to the already suffocating environment. Meanwhile, in Sing Sing, a different kind of strain played out. Inmates were brought together for group exercises. Lines of prisoners marching, performing tasks in unison, a display of discipline and subordination. Some followed dutifully, eyes fixed on the floor, muscles tensing under the orange jumpsuits. Others resisted subtly, shifting steps slightly, exchanging glances that could signal dissent. The psychological strain was palpable. The tension between compliance and rebellion threaded through the room like an electric current. Late night brought no reprieve. In Alcatraz, the isolation cells held secrets and sometimes screams, muffled but piercing in their intensity. Daniel traced the edge of his bunk, trying to focus on something beyond the bars, beyond the stone. His tattoos were a silent comfort, a reminder of identity amidst the system's relentless attempt to erase individuality. A small note appeared under the door, a message scrawled in pencil, cryptic, hinting at alliances forming, perhaps even a plan to survive this oppressive environment. Every line of the note was read twice, thrice, eyes darting up at the tiny slot in the door, imagining who had passed it and why. At Sing Sing, the night shift began. Guards patrolled slowly, shadows stretching long across the concrete floors, teal and amber reflections bouncing off walls and metal. Prisoners whispered through cell vents, sharing information about new arrivals, potential threats, and opportunities. Tattoos and orange jumpsuits created a tapestry of identity and status. Some marked men were respected, others feared. The subtle psychological games intensified as each inmate weighed risk against reward. Back at Alcatraz, the first acts of quiet defiance began to surface. Daniel and Raymond experimented with subtle gestures, moving in unison to avoid notice, sending coded messages through vent systems, small acts of rebellion that allowed them to reclaim a sense of agency. Each movement was careful, deliberate, a balancing act between freedom and exposure. The walls, cold and unyielding, seemed almost alive, testing every decision, every breath. Meanwhile, Sing Sing inmates navigated alliances and rivalries with precision. Tattoos acted as visual cues, signaling past histories and affiliations. Conversations were layered, often double-meaning, requiring constant vigilance to interpret. One slip of the tongue could lead to isolation, punishment, or worse. The psychological games were ongoing, a constant reminder that survival depended not just on strength, but on intellect, patience, and reading human behavior. By early morning, both prisons settled into a tense rhythm. Inmates slept fitfully, waking to the sound of doors clanging, footsteps echoing down the hallways, and the distant voices of guards. Every waking moment was a test of endurance, every glance a calculation. Daniel and Raymond reviewed the notes, traced the movements of guards, and adjusted their behavior accordingly. Across the continent, in Sing Sing, similar strategies unfolded, a delicate balance of observation, adaptation, and silent resistance. And as the first light of day crept across Alcatraz's rocky island and the Hudson River bathed Sing Sing in a cold glow, one truth became clear. Confinement was not just about walls and bars. It was a test of the human mind, a relentless battle between control and resistance, compliance and rebellion. Survival depended not only on strength, but on cunning, observation, and the ability to manipulate the invisible forces that governed life behind bars. Every tattoo told a story, every glance carried weight, and every whispered word could change the course of a man's day or his life. In these prisons, power was fluid, survival was tactical, and the mind was both prisoner and weapon. The corridors of Alcatraz had grown colder, the steel and concrete almost pulsing with a quiet menace. Daniel Morris moved along the narrow hallway, his footsteps soft against the worn floors, tattoos catching the faint amber glow of flickering lights. Each cell door seemed to loom larger, each shadow a potential threat. The air smelled faintly of damp concrete and antiseptic. and yet it carried whispers of plans and defiance. Raymond Carter watched from his bunk, eyes tracking Daniel's movements with precision. They had started coordinating. Subtle signals passed through small notes and gestures, forming a quiet rebellion that defied the rigid structure of the prison. Every flicker of a guard's shadow, every echo down the corridor, was a test of their nerves. In the stillness, even the smallest sound, the scratch of pencil on paper, the gentle creak of a hinge, felt amplified, significant. Meanwhile, at Sing Sing, a different tension prevailed. Inmates navigated the yard and corridors with calculated caution, tattoos and orange jumpsuits forming a living map of alliances, rivalries, and unspoken hierarchies. The guards' eyes were everywhere, yet the prisoners had learned to read the patterns, to find small gaps in the surveillance, and to exploit them. It was a chess game played in silence, every move deliberate, every glance weighted. In Alcatraz, Daniel and Raymond began to test the limits of the system. They experimented with minor deviations from routine, shifting positions in the cells, subtly altering movements during meal times, passing notes in ways that risked exposure. Each act was small but significant, a reclaiming of agency within walls designed to erase individuality. The tattoos on their arms and necks became markers of identity, silent declarations of presence amidst the monotony. A quiet plan took shape. They began to synchronize small acts of defiance, subtle tapping on pipes to communicate, minor disruptions timed to coincide with guard rotations, small movements that, unnoticed by the untrained eye, created ripples of control and awareness. Each success, no matter how minor, reinforced a sense of empowerment that the prison sought to suppress. Sing Sing reflected a similar dynamic. Groups of prisoners began to communicate through coded gestures and whispers, exploiting the gaps in surveillance. Trust was fragile, but it was essential. One misstep could mean isolation, punishment, or worse. Tattoos served as visual codes, symbols of history, affiliation, and experience, helping to establish who could be trusted and who could not. Back in Alcatraz, the warden's presence loomed large. Warden Ellis walked the hallways in crisp suits, a silent shadow over the prisoners. Yet even he could not see the subtle rebellions unfolding under his nose. The inmates had learned that resistance did not need to be loud or violent. It could be quiet, careful, and psychologically devastating to those who believed absolute control was possible. The psychological strain intensified. Sleep was broken by distant noises, the hum of the prison's ventilation, and the knowledge that observation was constant. Shadows moved strangely in the teal and amber lighting, exaggerating every perceived threat. Daniel traced his tattoos with his fingers as a grounding ritual, a reminder of self amidst the systematic attempts to erase it. In Sing Sing, tensions reached a peak during evening lockdown. Guards moved through the corridors with a measured intensity, checking cells, monitoring movement, attempting to reinforce dominance. But prisoners had adapted. Notes slid under doors, whispers passed through vents, coded taps echoed along the walls. The balance of power was delicate, constantly shifting between visible authority and invisible defiance. Daniel and Raymond's silent rebellion began to influence others. Small gestures were copied, minor strategies adopted by neighboring cells. A rhythm emerged, an unspoken language of survival, resistance, and calculated defiance. It was a psychological battle, waged not with fists, but with patience, observation, and the understanding of human behavior. The night deepened, the fog outside Alcatraz thickening, cloaking the island in secrecy. Inside, the prisoners' minds were alive with strategies, potential risks, and the subtle thrill of resistance. In Sing Sing, the night yard was quiet, but the energy was palpable, an electric tension of calculated movements, hidden alliances, and the constant weighing of danger against opportunity. Every tattoo, every glance, every whispered word was a tool in this invisible war. Power was fluid, and survival depended on reading the currents of control and defiance. The prisoners had learned that freedom within these walls was not given. It was carved out through ingenuity, courage, and patience. By early morning, the pattern was clear. Both prisons had become arenas not just of incarceration, but of psychological warfare. Observation, control, rebellion, and survival intertwined in a complex dance. Daniel and Raymond, through subtle acts of defiance and calculated communication, had found a measure of autonomy, a glimmer of control over a system designed to crush individuality. And as the first light of day struck the high walls of Alcatraz and the towers of Sing Sing, one truth remained undeniable. The human spirit, even behind the thickest bars and the strictest controls, could not be entirely contained. Survival was as much mental as physical, and every small victory, every whispered message, every carefully traced tattoo was a step toward reclaiming a sense of freedom. In the shadows, in the silence, in the calculated defiance, the prisoners found themselves, and in doing so, they reminded the system that control was never absolute. The morning fog lifted over Alcatraz, revealing the island's jagged cliffs and the steel bars of countless cells. Inside, the quiet rebellion of the previous night had left ripples that no warden could immediately trace. Daniel Morris moved carefully through the hallways, tattoos stark against the orange jumpsuit, eyes sharp, ears tuned to the faintest sounds, the shuffle of a guard's boots, the distant clank of metal doors. He and Raymond Carter had become masters of subtlety, their acts of defiance invisible to some, undeniable to those attuned to the system's fractures. A coded tap echoed through the vents, a message passed from one cell to another. Inmates repeated the pattern, reinforcing coordination across the block. No loud chaos erupted. This was a rebellion waged in silence, in shadows, and in minds sharpened by confinement. Every inmate who participated became part of an unspoken network, each aware that one mistake could mean solitary confinement or worse. Yet, the risk itself strengthened resolve. At Sing Sing, the story was similar but distinct. Prisoners had begun using the yard, the corridors, and even work areas as channels of communication. Subtle signals, head tilts, hand gestures, small movements of the feet, conveyed instructions and warnings. Tattoos glimmered under the harsh fluorescent and amber lighting, each a visual badge of identity, experience, and connection. A silent understanding had formed. Unity was survival, strategy was freedom. The warden at Alcatraz, Ellis, paced the control office, reviewing security footage, noting anomalies, but never fully comprehending the patterns forming beneath his gaze. Every deviation, every subtle synchronization of prisoners' actions was psychological leverage. The guards were present, vigilant, but the prisoners had learned to work around the structure, to exploit timing, to create pockets of autonomy within the rigid confines of the institution. In one quiet cell, Daniel and Raymond examined a folded note that had traveled through the vent system. The paper contained instructions for small acts of coordination, ways to synchronize movements, and signals to observe guard patterns. Their hands, covered with tattoos, traced the edges of the paper as if mapping the possibilities it represented. This small object, so easily overlooked, became a tool of influence, a reminder that control was never total. Meanwhile, in Sing Sing, a similar network of silent communication had flourished. Inmates passed notes under doors, tapped coded rhythms along pipes, and communicated through subtle shifts in routine. Each small act of resistance was a statement. The prison could regulate movement and time, but it could not fully govern thought or spirit. As day turned to evening, Alcatraz's fog rolled back in, casting long shadows along the hallways. The prisoners had established a rhythm, a quiet assertion of identity and agency. The tattoos on arms and necks were more than art. They were symbols of survival, markers of connection, and declarations of presence in a place designed to erase individuality. Every glance, every small gesture, became part of a larger narrative of subtle resistance. The psychological stakes were high. Every action was measured, every decision carefully weighed. Sleep came fitfully, with dreams haunted by fluorescent light, clanging doors, and the distant, echoing taps of communication. Yet the prisoners persisted, driven by the understanding that freedom, even limited, was carved through strategy, observation, and courage. In Sing Sing, the warden's frustration grew as patterns emerged that were inexplicable to casual observation. He could see the outcomes, synchronized acts of subtle defiance, but could not pinpoint the mechanism. The prisoners had adapted, evolved, and developed resilience under extreme conditions. Their tattoos and orange jumpsuits were visual constants, but within those frames, the human mind had found autonomy and self-expression. Daniel and Raymond, in their cell, paused to watch shadows stretch across walls as the last light of day faded. The vent system had become a conduit of both information and hope. They realized that rebellion was not merely an act of defiance. It was an assertion of humanity. The system could impose order, but it could not suppress thought, creativity, or solidarity. As night enveloped the prisons, a calm, yet tense atmosphere settled. The prisoners' small victories were psychological triumphs, invisible to those outside, yet profound to those within. The quiet tapping, the subtle notes, the coordinated movements, all were markers of resilience, intelligence, and unbroken spirit. In Alcatraz, Daniel traced the lines of his tattoos, reflecting on the journey, the isolation, the observation, the subtle victories, and the constant psychological tension. Each scar, each mark, each small action told a story of survival and adaptation. The prison was a laboratory of control, but within it, the human mind had asserted its complexity, its depth, and its refusal to yield entirely. Across the miles in Sing Sing, similar reflections occurred among prisoners. Alliances, strategies, and quiet acts of resistance had created a network of shared experience. Each individual, while physically confined, had found ways to reclaim a measure of freedom, to assert identity, and to communicate in a system designed to enforce silence and uniformity. The warden's authority remained visible, yet subtle shifts in prisoner behavior suggested that absolute control was an illusion. The human spirit, even when constrained, adapted and evolved. Each tattooed arm, each orange jumpsuit, each whispered message testified to resilience, strategy, and defiance. As the camera pans away from Alcatraz's looming structure, its steel and concrete imposing against the dark waters, and Sing Sing's towers rising above the Hudson, one question lingers. If freedom is defined by autonomy, thought, and connection, then where does it truly exist? In the physical world, in the mind, or in the subtle acts that resist oppression? And so, the 25-day journey continues. Each prison, each story, each act of survival and psychological resilience reminds us that while walls can confine the body, they cannot fully contain the human spirit. The countdown is ongoing, the narrative evolving, and the lessons of control, resistance, and survival resonate far beyond the gates of Alcatraz and Sing Sing. The night falls, the fog rolls in, the prisoners rest, but the echoes of their quiet rebellion linger. In the end, survival is more than physical endurance. It is a psychological triumph, a testament to the complexity and resilience of the human mind. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content.